Alright guys, it's me, Pyramid Head, back again after taking way too long of a break, and I'm going to be continuing my look at the Punisher comic series, looking at the first ongoing from issue 14 to issue 25, and the second annual, and I'm sorry I took so long to get to this. I just have been lazy about keeping up with this, but I'm going to jump right into this, and like I said in the last video, my plans is that I'm going to look at the first ongoing, the first, run of the Punisher ongoing with, up until I think it's somewhere around issue 80 something, when the first, crossover between the three different ongoings he had going at the same time. It was Punisher, Warzone, and, War Journal. They all cross over in a story called Suicide Run, and I'm going to keep looking at it. I'm going to keep looking at the regular ongoing, just the Punisher title, up until that. Then I will read the War Journal issues up until that starts, and then I'll read Warzone up until that starts, and then I'll do that storyline, and then I'll go back and cover each comic until I get to the last one, which is a big crossover, which concludes these three series called Countdown, I think it's called. So yeah, in this one I'm going to start with issue number 14. And in this one, the Punisher goes undercover at a high school as a social studies teacher, trying to track down one of Kingpin's men. Now, this story is pretty hilarious. It's Punisher pretending to be a social studies teacher, and one of the first things he does when he gets to this totally just overrun school is he goes and he throws a troublemaking kid out the window. Now, luckily, he's on the first floor, so no one dies and he doesn't get in trouble. But it's just hilarious watching him be the tough, hard-ass social studies teacher. It reminded me of that Jim Belushi movie called The Principal. And the guy he's looking for is one of Kingpin's drug-dealing cronies who is 25, but he looks real young, so he can hide out in the high school real easily. Which just has me it has me thinking of this as like a reverse version of 21 Jump Street. Only instead of cops hiding out in high school, it's criminals. And it ends up with him there's some funny stuff going. Eventually he tracks the guy down to like his underground drug lab and like defeats him there. And because of the events of this comic, he ends up starting a war with the Kingpin. And that covers issues 15 through 18. And so Kingpin pushes back against the Punisher, and so he decides to put a team together, which consists of Microchip, Mr. Brooks, who's a teacher who worked at the high school, and Reese, who is one of the students there, and as well as Conchita, whose husband was killed in, I believe it was the Charles Manson issue. Well, the character wasn't Charles Manson, but it was very clearly based on Manson when they was trying to break out of prison in that storyline a couple issues back. And so they get together. He brings them down to this place in the Everglades to train. It might not be the Everglades, but it's definitely in the Florida swamp. And so they're down there training. He's out with Reese. Reese gets shot in the head by one of the Kingpin's assassins almost immediately, which I thought was kind of funny. And so it's like, okay, yeah, we got this guy together. Like, what was the point of this team if Reese is just going to get killed immediately? Now, it is kind of tragic that Reese gets killed because, like, he is, like, a high school student. But at the same time, it's like, okay, what was the point of this character if he was going to die immediately? And so they vacate the training camp, go back to New York, and they start going, Punisher and Microchip start going after the Kingpin's money because he does all this computerized accounting stuff and stuff like that. And this is going on around the same time they're training in Florida, but they end up going after one of his gambling businesses, and they drop a bunch of money out of a window, which was an image that showed up in the 2004 movie. And because of all the stuff that's going on, Kingpin drops his computerized accounting and then hires traditional super accountants who work for the Triad. So they're Chinese super accountants, basically. And all I can think of is fucking Lau from The Dark Knight talking about how he's good at calculation. That's what these guys reminded me of. And they bring a psychic hitman along whom his powers aren't defined that well. And he tries to take on the Punisher, but then he kills Conchita, so it's just Frank, Brooks, and Microchip left. And so they end up having an assault on the Kingpin's tower. Frank gets his ass kicked by the Kingpin. And then he decides to not kill, and then Frank decides he's not going to kill the Kingpin and back off because apparently, killing the Kingpin will lead to larger gang wars. And it'll cause even more innocent people to be killed. And this is a huge anticlimax. And it's not a very good ending. And what sucks about it is that this was already handled in Circle of Blood, that very first Punisher solo comic, where he goes after the Kingpin and he thinks he kills him, but it turns out it was a fake, and that this causes greater gang fighting. So Frank learned absolutely nothing from that story, and is just making the same mistakes again. And I'm not really sure I like it all that much. And then Brooks is like, yeah, I'm tired of this. I'm just going to go back. And so that ends that Punisher versus the Kingpin story. It's an okay story. Like, I mean, the first part where Punisher is going undercover at the high school, that's the best one just because of how funny it is. The rest of it's fine. Like, it's a fairly good story. Like, the idea of Punisher putting a team together and training them and going after the Kingpin's money is actually a pretty solid one. And that image of dumping all the money out the window is pretty neat. But, I mean, once again, it's just a retread of stuff that was done in Circle of Blood and just ends up making the same point. And it's kind of like really the best part of it is there's kind of a cool car chase where they end up driving the battle van into the river. That's really about it. Number 19 is a standalone issue where Punisher is setting up fake drug deals to get money from drug dealers, but he's not doing it to fund his war like you would think, but he's trying to keep a counseling center for veterans open. And I find that kind of interesting because so often you don't think about the Punisher's military history, at least not in this era before the Max stuff and Bourne and whatnot. And this idea of Frank going out of his way to take care of other veterans like himself who are probably worse off than even he is, I think adds a little bit more depth to his character. And so what happens is that he's doing a deal with this guy called Spider-Rogue, who's also a crazy veteran, who's Australian, I think. And the deal goes bad, and Rogue is just like shooting off bullets and kills the single mother who lives across the hall. And he flees back to Australia. She was like an Asian woman too, so he went crazy, had a Vietnam flashback and thought she was VC, and so he killed her. And so he flees back to Australia. And Frank goes after him, and Roque is having these like Vietnam flashbacks, and he thinks that it's like his past catching up to him for all this horrible stuff he did. And then Punisher like drops a spider on him and kills him with that, which is very Australian. But I found this whole storyline interesting. It's not the greatest one and done. Like, I mean, if it was like an issue longer, you could have done a little bit more with it. But the idea of Frank going up against a veteran who's dealing with his trauma in a different way, I thought was an interesting way to was an interesting enough story in its own right, and the fact that he killed a guy who calls himself Spider with a spider was kind of amusing. Now, moving on to issue number 20. This is once again another standalone story, and he's going to Vegas to stop a hitman from killing a key witness, and it's a hitman that he's never seen before, and there's this woman that he has to protect, and there's an interesting twist because not everything goes to plan, and the witness ends up getting killed because the hitman wasn't who he expected to be. It was actually the woman, I think, or it was the man disguised as a woman. It was something weird like that. And it was an alright story, but not the best. And now the rest of this run of issues from 21 to 25 is the weirdest excuse for an ongoing story I've ever read. It's like, okay, so Frank is going into like really small-time crime. He's looking into it. And he's investigating a crooked boxing promoter who's fixing fights. And he fails to stop him because the boxer's girlfriend is in on it and, like, poisons him, and he ends up dying in the ring, I think. Her name's Iris Green. And that's basically the end of the issue, so Frank basically fails to accomplish anything. And I figured, okay, it's one and done, but then the next issue, he's still chasing after Iris, and I'm like, you're tracking a woman who, because you have a grudge against her, fixing a boxing match? It's really weird. And so he tracks her to a ninja training camp in the Midwest. Because to follow her this far across the country just seems like a little much to me. But it's not really a ninja training camp. It's a place full of rednecks learning how to fight, and it's run by like fake ninjas. It's a really weird story. It's basically just like a survivalist camp that's called a ninja camp. And they're learning certain things about fighting, but it's very obviously bullshit. And then this woman named Catherine Yakamoto shows up, who's a ninja who helps Frank take down this place, take down the instructors and stuff. And it turns out that the real Japanese ninjas want to punish this place for using their name, and she invites them to come to her father's estate in Japan. And so he goes there, and on the way there, when he gets there, he hooks up with, not only does he get to the estate, but he hooks up with these people called the Shadow Masters, who were like 3 people who lived down the hall from him or something, and he met them before in the War Journal issue I haven't read yet. And so it's this story about how, you know, he's visiting Yakamoto, and he's in a feud with this criminal group called the Eternal Sun, which is being run by Iris. So Iris went from the girlfriend of a boxer who poisons him to fix a match to being the head of like a Japanese terrorist group, which is really weird, and I don't quite get that. And then and like Yakamoto wants Frank to open a proper ninjutsu training place in the West, and I'm like, doesn't really seem like the Punisher's bag, really. It just seems like an odd thing to have the Punisher do. I didn't really buy into that all that much. And it's strange. And so they end up, and the whole thing feels like it's more like an advertisement for these characters called the Shadow Masters than anything to actually do with the Punisher. It feels like they're using the Punisher to shill these characters. And so they infiltrate the base, and it turns out that they're trying to set up this trade agreement with a U.S. senator who's in the Midwest somewhere, I want to say Nebraska. And when you see this guy, he is totally the most cartoonish cowboy guy ever, who loves his guns and stuff. And you find out, and basically what's going on is that Iris fixed the fight to earn the Eternal Son enough amount of money so that they can use this money to negotiate that trade deal with the senator. And apparently she grew up in Japan, which facilitated her entry into the organization. Not entirely sure I want to buy into that, but the trade deal with the senator is supposed to shift Japanese politics in their favor. But then it turns out they're really after this special fighter jet that's being developed in the senator's home state. And so basically this whole plot resolves with them getting Punisher and the Shadow Masters going after them at like the military base where this thing is being constructed. And, Iris ends up finally getting killed and stuff like that. And then Punisher's just like, no, Catherine, I can't take up your father's offer, bye. And she just leaves him behind. And he's standing there in front of like the fire after this place is being burned down. He goes like, war journal entry, I think I'm in love. Every time this girl shows up, there's fireworks, which is a really terrible joke. And it was an alright story arc, but it just felt like it started in a weird place and went to a place which didn't make any sense to be a sequel to this whole dirty boxing thing. And it felt like it was trying to shill these characters called the Shadow Masters, whom I really didn't care all that much about. So yeah, moving on to annual number 2, there's multiple stories here. There's a story that involves Punisher and the Moon Knight teaming up to fight Snake People, and there's like references to like Robert E. Howard and Conan here, where it's like this weird like drug clinic where they take the people who come in there and inject them with this thing that turns them into basically Robert E. Howard's Snake People, and they end up fighting in a mansion and stuff like that. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, and there's no conclusion to it. Like, it's never resolved what's actually going on here, but it was pretty funny and entertaining just seeing Punisher and Moon Knight together fighting Snake People, just the novelty of it. And once again, I think it's meant to be tying into whatever the event that year was, but I don't know what that is, so it doesn't make any sense to me. And then we get another story focusing on Microchip, and he's protecting Vietnamese immigrants from gangsters who help them, get smuggled into the country. And it's not a bad story. It's interesting seeing Microchip go out on his own and be a bit of a badass, and he's also testing out this tech for the Punisher, and it's a pretty fun story. There's not that much to it, though. And then the next story is just a bunch of vignettes where the Punisher is showing off his different martial arts skills in multiple disciplines, and it was a fun romp. And then comes the one non-Punisher related story I read here, which is Conan fighting Thoth-Amon, who's using this thing called a snake crown to turn the Zingaran court into snake people, I think, and I guess that ties into what was going on in that Moon Knight story earlier. It was cool reading a Conan comic because it's one of those things where Marvel was writing Conan comics well into the 90s, and it's just fun reading that. And reading that, it's like Punisher and Conan in one book together. That's actually pretty fun. And it was all narrated by Uatu the Watcher, which was kind of entertaining. So I guess he actually was watching and not having Stan Lee inform for him, I guess is saying something. So yeah, the second year's worth of the Punisher ongoing is pretty solid. It's not great, mainly because it's mainly just these 2 long story arcs, which could have been a lot better. The art is mainly solid throughout, mostly by Eric Larson. It's just the fact that the storylines just could have been better. I would have preferred more one-and-dones and maybe shorter story arcs that made a little bit more sense and were more Punisher-focused. Like, this whole thing of Punisher putting a team together to fight the Kingpin could have been developed a bit better and could have ended better. And the whole thing about Punisher going to a dirty boxing match should have just been a one-and-done, and then the rest of the story with the Eternal Son and the ninjas and the Shadow Masters should have been its own arc. Like, it wouldn't have been great, but it would have been better than tying it into a dirty boxing. Yeah, that was just odd. So, I'm going to try and get the next few videos of this done a little bit faster, and I'll go a little bit more in depth in the next couple videos because it won't have been months since I read them. And I think what I'll do next, just to like, get another video out a little bit quicker, is I'll read like a one-shot issue. Like I have like the adaptation of the '89 Dolph Lundgren Punisher film, which I believe I'm going to get up to that point that movie came out pretty quickly, because I think I'm into '89 already with these comics. If not, I'm still at like the latter half of '88, but I'm getting there pretty closely because I know the letters pages for the last several issues have been talking about the upcoming Punisher movie, and like all these people talking about casting choices and whatnot have been pretty fun, especially when the one troll jumped in and said, "I choose Pee Wee Herman," which was just hilarious. See, I look forward to reading the letters pages and seeing what people have to say, and that's always a lot of fun. So yeah, I'll probably review that adaptation of the '89 Punisher movie pretty soon. That should be interesting to read, just to see how they adapted it, what they cut out, what they left in. I really want to know at the bit where they say who sent you and he says Batman. I'm really curious to see if that's there. And I'm curious to see if the bit they cut from the script where he painted a skull on his bulletproof vest is in the comic. Because that was something they cut out during production, sadly. But yeah, that was my look at the second year of the first Punisher ongoing. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, bye.